You never think it'll happen to you, that you'll be the one who catches the eye of someone so twisted, so determined to do you harm. But on a cold winter night in 1980, I learned that monsters are real, and sometimes they come dressed as men. I was living at the end of Blue Diamond Road in Las Vegas back then, back when it was just a lonely stretch of asphalt cutting through the desert, long before the houses and the lights crowded in. It was a place where the night could swallow you whole, where the only sound you'd hear was the wind howling across the empty plains and the distant hum of the city, a world away. I worked as an executive assistant for a real estate developer. It was a busy job with long hours spent juggling schedules, meetings, and everything else that came with working for a man who was always on the move. I loved my work, but it often meant late nights, driving home alone under the cover of darkness. That night was no different. I had stayed late to finish up some reports that needed to be on my boss's desk first thing in the morning. The office was quiet by the time I left, the lights dimmed, and the only sound was the hum of the air conditioning. I locked up, pulled on my coat, and stepped out into the cold night air, ready to make the long drive home. That's when I saw him. A man in a yellow Volkswagen Beetle, parked across the street. At first, I didn't think much of it. A lot of people drove those cars back then, and the sight of one in Las Vegas was nothing out of the ordinary. But there was something about the way he just sat there, the way his eyes seemed to follow me as I walked to my car. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that the shadows were playing tricks on me. But as I drove down that lonely road, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that I was being followed. I glanced in my rearview mirror, and my heart sank. There he was, the yellow Beetle trailing behind me, his headlights a pair of piercing eyes in the dark. I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence, that he was just another driver heading in the same direction. But as I made the turn onto Blue Diamond Road, my stomach tightened with fear. There were no other cars, no streetlights, just miles of empty road and desert stretching out in front of me. And still, he followed. Every instinct told me to keep driving, to push that gas pedal to the floor and not look back. But I was only a few minutes from home, and I convinced myself that if I could just get inside, I'd be safe. After all, who would dare follow someone into their own home? When I reached my house, I pulled into the driveway, my heart pounding in my chest. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking as I tried to unlock the door. I could hear the sound of his engine idling behind me, could feel his eyes burning into my back. Finally, I got the door open and slipped inside, locking it behind me. I rushed to the window and peered out from behind the curtain, hoping against hope that he would drive away. But he didn't. Instead, he just sat there, his car a menacing shadow in the moonlight, as if he was daring me to make the next move. For what felt like an eternity, I stood there, watching him, my heart racing. Then, as if he had decided I wasn't worth the effort, or perhaps to toy with me even further, he slowly began to drive away. His headlights cut through the darkness, the sound of his engine growing fainter as he disappeared down the road. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, that he'd be back. But for the moment, I was safe, or so I thought. Telling myself I was just being paranoid, I tried to shake off the lingering unease. I kicked off my stilettos and peeled off my pencil skirt, blouse, and blazer, tossing them onto the chair in my bedroom. I just wanted to wash away the stress of the day, so I stepped into a hot shower, letting the steam wrap around me like a comforting embrace. The water felt like it could cleanse away the tension, and for a brief moment, I allowed myself to believe that the strange man in the yellow Volkswagen was nothing more than a figment of my tired imagination. After my shower, I slipped into a nightgown and crawled into bed, pulling the covers up tight around me. The house was quiet, and I thought I would finally be able to rest. But just as I started to drift off, I was jolted awake by the unmistakable sound of breaking glass. My heart raced as I realized that the nightmare was far from over. I grabbed the phone to call the police, but as I pressed the receiver to my ear, I was met with silence. The line was dead. He had cut the phone line. My blood ran cold as the reality of the situation sank in. This wasn't just some random act of vandalism. He had planned this. He was coming for me. Suddenly, the house was plunged into darkness. The lights flickered once, twice, and then went out completely. I was alone, in the dark, with a madman inside. My heart raced as I tried to think, tried to figure out what to do next. I couldn't call for help. I couldn't see. All I could do was run. I dropped the phone and bolted through the house, my mind a blur of fear and adrenaline. I could hear him moving through the house, his heavy footsteps crunching over the broken glass as he searched for me. I ducked into the hallway closet, trying to steady my breathing, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. I held my breath, listening to his footsteps. Closer, closer, each one louder, more deliberate than the last. I could see the shadows shifting under the door as he passed by, his hand brushing against the wood. I gripped the handle of the baseball bat I kept in the closet, praying that he wouldn't find me. But then, as if he could sense my presence, he stopped. I heard the doorknob rattle, then turn slowly. My blood ran cold as the door inched open, his silhouette filling the frame. He stared at me, those cold, dark eyes peering through the slits of the ski mask. For a moment, we just stood there, frozen, staring at each other. Then he spoke, his voice low and menacing. "I've been watching you," he said, his words dripping with malice. "You're not getting away from me." I gripped the bat tighter, my knuckles white, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I knew I had to act, and fast. "I don't think so," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "Not today, you son of a bitch." Before he could react, I swung the bat with everything I had, aiming for his head. The bat connected with a sickening thud, and he stumbled back, dropping the knife he had been holding. I didn't stop. I swung again and again, every ounce of fear and adrenaline fueling my strength. He fell to the floor groaning in pain, blood dripping from the deep gash on his head. I knew I had to act quickly, that leaving him unconscious on my floor wasn't an option. There was no one around to help me and I couldn't risk him waking up, so I searched his pockets, finding his car keys. As I clutched the keys in my hand, I knew what I had to do. I dragged his limp body out of the house, struggling to pull him across the gravel driveway. My breath was visible in the cold night air, but I didn't stop. I managed to heave his body into the trunk of his yellow Volkswagen Beetle. When I opened the trunk, I found a chilling sight, a murder kit, complete with duct tape, zip ties, a shovel, and a body bag. Looking at the kit, the car, and his mask, the realization hit me. This man was a Ted Bundy copycat. He wasn't here for me specifically. I was just a random victim, chosen by chance. My fear turned to cold determination. I pulled out the body bag and rolled his unconscious form into it, zipping it up tight. The desert stretched out before me, endless and dark. I drove deep into the night, far from the city lights, until I reached a desolate spot where no one would ever find him. I got out of the car and dragged the body bag from the trunk, my muscles burning with the effort. The shovel was heavy in my hands, but I kept digging, the sound of metal against dirt filling the empty silence. When the hole was deep enough, I pushed the bag into it, the sound of his unconscious body hitting the earth echoing in the still night. As I stood over the grave, looking down at the man who had planned to make me his next victim, I felt a wave of finality wash over me. He started to stir inside the bag, groaning as he began to regain consciousness. I watched as the dirt started to cover him, sealing his fate. Before covering him completely, I whispered my final words to him. "You should have been more careful. Some of us know how to fight back." He let out a weak, muffled cry as I shoveled the last of the dirt over him, the sound quickly fading into the silence of the desert. I didn't stop until the grave was completely filled, the earth packed down as if nothing had ever been disturbed. The desert was vast, and I knew that no one would find him out here. I stood there for a moment, catching my breath, feeling the cold night air on my skin. The fear that had gripped me earlier was gone, replaced by a strange sense of calm. I had survived. I had fought back. And I had won. With a final glance at the makeshift grave, I turned back to the car. I drove it deeper into the desert, abandoning it where it would eventually be consumed by the sands and forgotten. The mask, the kit, the car, they were all relics of a twisted mind that had chosen the wrong person to terrorize. As I walked away from the car, the vast expanse of the desert stretching out before me, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The stars above were cold and distant, but they were the only witnesses to what had just happened. I was alone, and that's how it would stay. I made my way back to my house as dawn began to break, the first light of day chasing away the remnants of the night. I had buried a man in the desert, a man who had meant to end my life. But as the sun rose, I knew that part of me had been buried out there too. The part that had once believed in the safety of the ordinary. The part that had trusted in the kindness of strangers. I never spoke of that night to anyone. I lived my life, raised my family, and found happiness in the small moments that make life worth living. But every now and then, when the wind howled across the desert, or when I caught a glimpse of a yellow Volkswagen, I would remember. I was 34 years old at the time, and I survived that night. Unlike Stephanie in the last story, I lived to tell my tale. I bet you didn't see that one coming, did you? You see, sometimes the darkness doesn't win. Sometimes it's the ordinary people like me who find the strength to fight back, to reclaim our lives from the monsters lurking in the shadows. And I only return to tell this story as a warning. If you're ever alone at night, be mindful of your surroundings. Trust your instincts and never underestimate the darkness that may be watching. Most importantly, be ready to fight for your life at all costs. Because sometimes it's your own strength that makes the difference between being a victim and being a survivor. As long as someone remembers, the darkness will never win. Happy birthday to me, bitch. You lived.